Session of the Board of Education. We have not met in executive session, so we need to do the salute to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, Mr. Markarian will be going in for Mr. McLaughlin for roll calls tonight. So we'll take the roll call.
Mr. Barr? Here. Mrs. Swarner?
Here.
Mrs. Gray?
Here.
Mrs. Cassell?
Here.
Mrs. McGowan?
Here.
Mrs. Shaw?
Here.
Mrs. Richmond?
Here.
Mrs. Woolridge?
Here. Here. Thank you. I'd just like to draw your attention to the statement of public notice in your agenda. The meeting is being recorded, as it has been for the last bunch of meetings. And if you're coming up to the mic to speak to us, please put your name and address on the clipboard. There are a couple of different times where we take public comment. There's a public forum on agenda items for anything that's on the agenda, and then at the end there's a public forum on non-agenda items. And in addition tonight, we have one other public forum on the agenda, which Mr. McCarran will speak about in a couple minutes. We don't seem to have a student representative. So we're up to item 6, which is staff recognition. Mr. McCarran?
Yes, I'm very excited to announce that our Mr. William Ortega of Ridge High School has won a Young Audiences Art Champion Educator of the Month Award. And we're very pleased to have Michelle Margliano here from Young Audiences. And she's going to come up and tell us a little bit about this award and present it to Mr. Ortega.
Thank you, Mr. McCarran. My name is Michelle Margliano, and I am the Special Projects and Assessment Coordinator with Young Audiences of New Jersey and Eastern Pennsylvania. And so Young Audiences is the leading arts education provider in our region. And so we recognize the importance of acknowledging creativity and innovation in the communities that we serve. And so recently we started to identify teaching artists, teachers, and school communities and students that we feel are exceptional in the work that they do to be advocates and to take action around arts education. And so Mr. Ortega, as many of you know, is the photography teacher at Ridge High. In addition to his exceptional work here as an educator, he's also a practicing professional artist with a working studio in Hoboken. You could catch some of his work in a few weeks at the Jersey City Arts Studio Tour, which is a free self-guided event in Jersey City. In addition to his work as an artist and as a teacher for young audiences, Mr. Ortega is a teaching artist with our organization. He's been working with us for about 7 years, and he's been really designing and implementing high-quality arts programming for children throughout the state. His work with young audiences began in a program called the Ennis Bewley Project. And this summer, he helped us to pioneer a workforce program called Artworks, which brought 10 students from throughout New Jersey to a studio in Hoboken. And those 10 students were paid as professional interns to work with Mr. Ortega for over 6 weeks. And then they curated an exhibit in Jersey City's City Hall. So this evening, we really at Young Audiences would like to thank the Bergens Township community for joining us and celebrating the dedication and the commitment to arts education that Mr. Ortega has tirelessly and repeatedly showed over the years that we have worked with him, as well as what he has been accruing over his entire teaching career. So without any further ado, Mr. Ortega, on behalf of Young Audiences of New Jersey and Eastern Pennsylvania and our Board of Trustees and our staff, we'd like to thank you for all of your work in helping us to meet our mission.
I know you have a long agenda. But I'd quickly like to thank the esteemed members of the Board of Education for allowing this moment to occur here in your presence. It's not very often that a teacher is given a moment of recognition like this, and for me, it's my first one, so I'm very humbled and honored to receive this tonight. I'd like to thank young audiences for this honor and acknowledgement of my efforts in this past summer, and would feel remiss if I didn't mention my colleagues at Ridge High School, who I feel play an instrumental role in my receiving this award. Each and every one. It is by their example, with their noses to the grindstone, that inspires me to be a better teacher. Day in and day out, these people are focused on how we can improve, and every year we manage to do it. This makes me proud to work in this district. I'm so proud I tell my friends, I tell my family, I try not to boast too much about the people I work for and the people who I work with and their ability to teach. Tonight I have this rare occurrence of having two employers who see the commitment I make as an educator and to the children I teach. I'm grateful. But the connection between Burlington Township and young audiences doesn't end here. This past summer, as I worked with young audiences in art court apprentices, I was able to hire 2 graduates from Ridge High School to help me implement the program that I designed. They were able to use the skills they learned at Ridge and in the real world, and I couldn't have felt more fulfilled than seeing this. They helped me refine projects and organize prints and prepare an exhibition, while at the same time I was able to mentor the new group and see them succeed in creating their beautiful visions. Thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. Ortega. My daughter at middle school is taking photography right now, and I wish my high school students had, but they take so many music classes they've never been able to at Ridge, which I understand is a real shame because I've heard really good things about the program. Thank you for coming tonight. We are up to public forum on canine sweeps, which I think is going to be after Mr. Markarian says a few words about that.
Sure. So in the next section of the agenda under Superintendent's Report is something that I would like the board to pass as a resolution. If you'll recall, last year we undertook a variety of efforts to try to take a look at deterring the use of controlled dangerous substances, and one of the things that we set up at the time was some work with the Somerset County Prosecutor's Office in doing a random canine sweep at Ridge High School, and at the time it rolled a little bit late into the school year, and so we looked to put that off until sometime during this school year. So in communicating with the prosecutor's office, they did ask that we demonstrate that this was something that we still wanted to do in the current year, and some of the best practices to demonstrate that that is something that we would like to do would be to offer an opportunity for the public to comment on the use of the canine dog sweep so that the board could hear about it from the public. I think that they got a strong message from the public last year, but I agreed to follow up with the board as the county prosecutor's office asked me to do it, and offer this opportunity again, and to once again ask the board to pass a resolution that I could share with the prosecutor's office and the local Burns Township Police Department that this was something that the Board of Ed would still like us to work with those law enforcement agencies to arrange for the high school. So that's the reason why this is on the agenda. It wasn't so long ago that we were talking about it last school year, but as I explained, I was happy to do whatever the law enforcement agencies requested of me in order to try to make these arrangements happen. So that's the reason that we're revisiting this evening. And so at this time, I want to make sure that the board had an opportunity to hear any other comments about this topic, even though they certainly heard many of them last school year. Now's the chance.
Looking out there, is there anyone out there that wants to speak about this topic? We're up to superintendent's report. Would someone like to make a motion for items 1 through 3 in the superintendent's report? Second, Deb. comments or questions?
I just have a comment about the French trip. It's, last year, the trip happened on a non-school days, and this year it's been proposed to have one day off from school. And when I didn't vote for it last year, I said this is a slippery slope for the things that could happen coming down the road. In addition to this trip, there's nothing to stop the Spanish, groups to want to go to Puerto Rico or Cancun for a 3-day weekend. And this is just setting an example to move forward. I feel that one day is really not a big deal, but we're setting an example, and that's a bigger deal. And if it's difficult to get teachers to come on weekends or off times, I think the students and parents could pay more to cover the cost of the teachers in the same way that parents pay more to cover the cost of coaches because the stipend may not be enough. So there's alternate solutions to taking these trips without taking the students out of instructional time. So I cannot support it as it is presented right now. I would either like to see it maybe gone back to the table and worked on. If there's enough votes here to keep it as it is what it is. I just want to let you know, I really don't want to set the example that if there are options to take the kids out of school, I understand sometimes there's a schedule thing and you can't take them out of school, but if you have an option to do it on a non-school instructional time, where we're paying for past instructional time, we should try to do the other option where they don't miss school. So and I think in this particular case, that possibility is there. Some other solutions could be worked out, and I can't vote for this the way it is right now. So but I don't know if other people want to take it back to the drawing board or not.
I support the trip plan the way it is now, and I understand what you're saying about days off from school, but this isn't a vacation day. They'll be working. It'll be, I think we heard from the students that went last year. They're actually, it's a full day of academics, or more than a full day. It's at night, it's on the weekends in addition, so they're getting plenty of education. Now, if some child doesn't want to go on the trip, I'm sure there's arrangements. If you feel that you don't want to miss other classes, you don't have to go. I'm sure there's, you can stay back and do something else, but certainly it's very educational. They're getting more education probably in that day than with a typical 6-hour school day. Also, our students miss school for a variety of other activities. I'm happy that this is an academic endeavor versus some of the other clubs and things, which I don't, I think school has to be exciting for students too, and they have to, develop a will to love learning, and these are the kind of opportunities that I think do that. I think it's also, you have to remember our staff. I'm just guessing because I didn't look into this, but one of the reasons why I think it wouldn't make sense to have it on a weekend is that person, the teachers who are going, will have worked all the week, right? They'll have worked a full week, and then they're supposed to work all weekend and 24 hours a day on the weekend, and then show up again on Monday. Now, maybe you might get people to do that, but I know that at least in my, please correct me if I'm wrong, but when we started to move activities to the weekends, what's happened is we have less activities because teachers have families too. They have activities outside of school. They can't give up their weekends just because it's more convenient for us. And I think it's a real loss when people don't have these, some of these trips stop, whether it's music trips or other things. So that's my opinion.
Do you want me to respond?
Well, does anyone else have something to say? Mike?
I see positives on both sides, but I didn't see any alternative to have it so that the students didn't miss school. I think I would have liked, here's a less desirable time, but we could do it and not miss school on Memorial Day or something. I'm just picking a date. I think every day at school is important.
I know, Preeti, you had asked if we wanted to discuss as a board.
Could I just respond?
Okay, go ahead and respond.
I agree with you and a lot of your points that you made. It's not that it's very black and white. I think they do work all the time when they're, chaperoning. But it doesn't have to be teachers, it could be parents. And second, they picked it at a time that's adjacent to spring break. So even if you shift it, you come back to spring break, it's not, school, they're not coming back to school. So they could even work a week, take a day off, and, and then go Sunday, Monday, Tuesday if they want to. The thing is, there's other choices. I think we can do better than this. That's all I'm saying.
I know you had asked if the board would discuss the field trips in general, and whether a committee would look at them. We kind of discussed today when we were in advocacy, like recreating what happened last year when the trip was first proposed, and we sent it to had policy look at our policies, and we have 2 policies, one for competitions, which is mainly extracurricular type things like sports or music for overnight trips, and then there's an overnight academic policy. So we looked at the policies, I think, already, and we were okay with them as is, as far as I understand, right? And then the curriculum committee had looked at it because, we had some concern that if we opened up the door for a trip that, like, tons of them would come out of the woodwork. We'd have, like, 15 trips, being proposed, which hasn't happened. So, I don't know how the rest of the board feels about it at this point, whether it needs to be sent back. Maybe I don't think the policy committee wants to look at the policies again.
Also, from a world language perspective, I think one thing we discussed when we approved this trip last year is realistically, French is the only language where we can do a similar type of trip because the students are able to get on a bus, go somewhere within, about 8 hours and come back. The reality is it would be almost cost prohibitive and impossible to do a similar trip to a Spanish-speaking country, an Italian-speaking country. I think we'd be a little hard-pressed to find a Latin-speaking country currently. So I really think this is the only world language currently where this is even an option. And the French-speaking students are fortunate.
But Cancun is cheap. You can fly to Cancun. And then there are artifacts and there's ruins you could go to. I'm just saying this is not the end. We could be opening up the doors for other things.
I'd like to respond to that. I think, it's a very common argument, I think we all make it sometimes, the slippery slope or the camel's nose under the tent, they say in politics. But I don't think we can, I think we just have to, evaluate what's before us today. And this is what's before us today. And I agree, if we would start getting many of them, then maybe we want to look at the policies again, we want to look at this one. But I don't think you can say anything negative about this particular trip because of, what might happen in the future. And I think, there was some trepidation maybe when we first approved this last year, but I think we got the report back on how it went. And I think that was, I assume the rest of the board thought that was a positive report. So this isn't a, let's go to Canada and have fun and, away from our parents for the weekend, we're just going to do party. It's not like that at all. I mean, that's, I think we heard pretty well. So I think we just have to evaluate the trip we have here. And, I understand your concerns about the other kind of trips, but I don't think that's before us to.
So does anybody want to move it even one day and let the parents pay a little bit more to cover the cost of the teachers? Because this trip right now, as it stands, is adjacent to spring break. So they're taking Friday off, they're going Saturday, Sunday, coming back Sunday night, I believe. So then after that is an entire week off for spring break. So this particular trip, you could just slide it over one day, and it would be Saturday, Sunday, Monday. And the parents, if the teachers want, could, charge to cover their costs of being chaperones, would be charged appropriately for the trip. I think there's other solutions. We don't have to have this as the only solution here that we vote on today.
Susan?
I'm good with the proposal as it is.
Going around the table, I would shift it one day.
We got another table?
I'm actually okay with the way it is right now because spring break is a planned vacation for family time, and I'm sure teachers also have time planned for that, designated for their time off for that week also. And they're only losing one day, which would be equivalent to any kind of field trip for a day. So I'm okay with it.
I agree, since it's one day and it's an educational trip, that
I also feel the same way. A one-day field trip is basically a one-day field trip, whether it's adjacent to the spring break or not, and I'm okay with that.
I'm okay with it the way it is also for the same reason, and I also remember what a positive experience it was the first time, and I fully expect it to be equally positive for the students when they go this year.
At the risk of sounding redundant, it was a phenomenal trip, and I would even rationally guess that the students who are on the trip are going to have more academic rigor than the kids who are in school the Friday before spring break. Just my thoughts.
Good point. Okay, so were there any comments or questions about any of the other items on your superintendent's report?
Can I say something about the trip, if you don't mind?
Sure.
So I'm the French teacher, and I assume you just agreed to it.
Well, we have to vote, but yeah, we can give our opinions and then we'll vote in a minute.
Just one thing that is important. One of a student that I had last year, and I thought he would drop French. I was sure he was going to drop French because I was his second year, and he came to Quebec with me. He was one of the most motivated kids. And I don't have him this year anymore. He's with Vanessa and Lauren. But each time he sees me in the hall, he's like, so is it going? Is it running this year? Is it running? So it's motivating the kids, besides the fact that they're really working 24 hours. And the issue that they have, it's not about the money. It's more about the parents that want to spend time with their kids. So that's what we don't want to take too much of the break. It's not about the money. It's just the fact that if we take Friday, the kids will have more time with their parents. And that's not because I need to rest. So, thank you.
Okay, so are we ready to roll call? It is 1, 2, 3.
Right, 1 through 3. Mr.
Yeah.
Byrne?
Yes on 1 and 2, no on 3.
Ms. Swerner?
Yes.
Mrs. Gray?
Yes.
Mrs. Cassell?
Yes.
Mrs. McGowan?
Yes.
Mrs. Shaw?
Yes on 1 and 2, no on 3, as it stands.
Mrs. Richmond?
Yes.
Mrs. Woolridge?
Yes.
Mrs. McEwen?
Yes.
Thank you. And then there's item number 4, which is we're hearing to speak about.
Right, so I just wanted to make sure that those of the public that are following this issue with respect to the park testing program are aware of a little bit of confusion that was the result of a memo issued by the Department of Education with respect to the graduation requirement for students. And the issue really centers around the fact that we are transitioning from one standardized state test to a new standardized state test. And just to be very clear, for the 2015 school year, the graduating class that will be with us this coming June, the graduation requirement is the HSPA, passing that high school proficiency assessment that they took as juniors last year. And if anyone had a problem passing it, they'll work on taking care of that during their senior year. So the class of 2015 is not at all in question, it's not an issue. It would really be the following 3 classes that the state is calling the transition period between the NK ask and the HSPA and the new graduation requirement that'll be coming after this 3-year transition period is over. So one of the things that kind of got into the news and got some folks a little concerned was this new requirement for graduation for that transition period, because the HSPA is gone, the parks are not officially a graduation requirement yet. So what would students be able to do in order to have a criteria whereby they can graduate? And so the state said, well, they can pass the park. And immediately everyone kind of panicked and said, what do you mean? You said they didn't have to pass the park. And then the state came back and clarified and said, they can pass the park, or they can pass one of the other tests that most of the students, and probably all the students here in this town, are going to be taking. That would be the SAT or the ACT. And then they also said if they're not taking any of those, then there could be a alternative method of evaluating the student's record to make sure they've done enough to graduate. So I just wanted to kind of clarify that the PARCC test is not a graduation requirement for the class of 2016, 17, or 18. However, if students do pass it, that can be used as a way to meet the graduation requirement, or they can receive a score of 400 or higher on an SAT, or 16 or higher on the ACT. So there's lots of methodologies by which the students will be deemed graduation material as far as the state is now concerned during this transition period. And that's timely since later tonight we're talking about the end of one era, as we're also talking about the beginning of another testing era.
Thank you, Nick. Mike?
I hope it's a worthwhile change. I have my doubts.
Okay, I guess we have the board presentation now. We're going to go down below for that.
And just one more comment. I recognize it's not the school board's decision.
Right. Yeah, well, we can talk about that later.
Okay, good evening, everybody. I have the privilege of bringing the death knell for NJAS, along with Mr. Hall here tonight. So we're here tonight for the Fall 2014 District Testing Report. This is a unique year for this testing report, and I'll be saying the same thing next year, because as Mr. Markarian said, we are looking at the end of one era and the beginning of another. It is the end of NJAS, and the end of HSBA, and the beginning of PARCC. So what does that mean? Well, that means we are going to talk about the final set of data points for these tests tonight. So Mr. Hall has labored over the data and made many charts. I will say that since this was the final testing report for this, I asked if he could keep it a little shorter than normal. So I'm happy to tell you, instead of 70 slides, it's only 67. So we have that to look forward to. We did trim it a bit. So what is the promise of the PARCC assessment? Mr. Byrne had it right, that we're all hopeful that it will be an improvement, but we're all unsure. There's certain trepidation from everyone. You're certainly not alone in this. We're all a little nervous about what PARCC will bring. They've made some promises, one of which I think we know is a problem. That's the very low ceiling that's on the NJAS test, where we have many, many students maxing out at 300, and it gives us very little real data on how they're achieving beyond that point. The second one is humorous, because no sooner did I type it into this presentation, one of the promises of PARCC was, as a computer-based test, we'd have much more rapid results. That would make sense, right? That it's on the computer as you enter it in, certainly for multiple choice sections anyway, you have instantaneous feedback, much like we have with map testing. Now, we received guidance 2 days ago regarding, or Friday, regarding the time we get data back, and it was no earlier than we currently get it, and in fact, maybe a little later. So I'm hopeful, and maybe I'm just a hopeless optimist, but I'm hopeful that that is just the state really hedging their bets, having no idea when they can get back to us, giving us a terribly bad prediction. That way, when it comes to us in late August, they can say, look, see, it's 3 weeks early. Aren't you super happy with PARCC? And that'll be my hope, I guess, for the next 10 months or so. The last one is testing skills, of course, based on the Common Core, talking about college and career readiness, and hopefully PARCC will be a better measure of those skills as well. So this is part one of 2 testing reports, so everyone is clear. Tonight we're going to be talking about all the state tests, right? NJAS, HSBA, and the biology competency test. The next report will be in November. That will be Ms. Shadis, and that will be the post-secondary report talking about AP tests, SAT tests, and the others. So this is part 1 of 2. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Mr. Hall to go over the data.
He did kill some of my slides. He wasn't joking. Okay, so very quickly, we have our alphabet soup. We have a lot of acronyms, a lot of names of tests and things like that. As we go through this, I'll be explaining those. Some of the guidelines, just to re-familiarize yourself. The goal that the state has set forth is that every student will be assessed. And what that means is we have that 95% of each of our student groups must sit to take the test. And that includes students with disabilities, students who are limited English proficient, pretty much all of our groups, our subgroups. That even includes out-of-district students. So if they are placed in another school district, we're still responsible for testing. Okay. A quick walk down memory lane. The New Jersey Ask and HSPA, since 2012, we're aligned or partially aligned with the Common Core state standards for math and English language arts. Students have multiple opportunities for passing the HSPA, our graduation requirement. Mr. Markarian mentioned earlier that students who will take the HSPA as juniors, if they don't pass it, they'll have additional opportunities to demonstrate that they have learned what they need to in order to get a high school diploma. A maximum of, well, they have up to 4 opportunities. Calculators are not used on many parts of the test, including short constructed responses in mathematics. And we are no longer beholden to the adequate yearly progress benchmarks set forth with the No Child Left Behind Act. Okay. Now I mentioned earlier subgroups, and that all of our subgroups needed to be tested. I'll hold this down a little bit, so it's not quite as loud. And when we talk about subgroups, we can talk about ethnic origin, we can talk about socioeconomic level, we can talk about language with regard to our limited English proficient groups, and special needs students are also considered to be a subgroup. So any of these subgroups that we're talking about, if the group has at least 30 students in it, that their scores are reported not only as total students, but as an individual subgroup. Okay, so now on to the NJ Ask. Okay, recall that the New Jersey Ask is administered to students in grades 3 through 8, and it is administered in the subjects of English language arts, which is both the reading and writing component as well as mathematics. In looking at reading here, some of the transitions, and I'll try and focus on the changes more than all of the details here, because I know many of you have had this fun experience before. In reading, there is an increasing focus on informational text, so that's one of the things that we've been seeing. And to the point where we have reading passages that are coming from literature, a wide variety of informational texts, and they're focusing on those texts even during when they're writing. They're going back to often the referencing the text. In grades 3 through 5, there are narrative and informational or explanatory writing tasks or opinion writing tasks. In grades 6 through 8, we also see persuasive or argument types of tasks. In grades 3 through 5, students are given 3 reading passages. In 6-8, 4 reading passages. And again, there's an increasing focus on informational reading selections as well as literature. Okay. 50%, at least 50% of the reading passages are informational. Okay. All items this year in 2014, were key to the Common Core state standards, and they were constructed response items were scored using an open-ended grades 3 through 5, writing tasks were opinion, narrative, or explanatory, and they were graded using the New Jersey holistic scoring rubric, which we use with our students here in the district as well. Okay. Writing tasks in grades 3 through 8, again, required students to respond to a wide variety of purposes: opinion, narrative, explanatory, informational, argument, persuasive, or narrative. And these were scored using a 6-point. Okay, I have some examples. Here's a informational explanatory writing prompt, the type that you might see in grades 3 through 5. Interesting science topic here. Relating to squirrels and their nut-bearing behaviors. Here's another one where the student, where the beginning of the story is given about Tony arriving and having a package. And so students are tasked with writing a narrative about why he's excited about the package. So this would be another elementary example. Okay. Here's a middle school writing prompt for an argument type task, dealing with electronic textbooks. So students are asked to take a position on whether or not they believe electronic textbooks should replace print textbooks. One of the important pieces here would be that they're challenged to include reasons, facts, examples, defending their argument. Another middle school example for an explanatory task. We have a quote from Anne Frank. Okay, and I mentioned before the holistic scoring rubric, and this is a modified version. The modified New Jersey Registered Holistic Scoring Rubric, this is what the scorers use, and this is also one of the rubrics that our staff members here in the district are trained to use. Okay. Bless you. Mathematics, grades 3 through 5. Again, one of the things to note are mathematics. NJS was key to the Common Core standards for mathematics. It included multiple choice, short constructed response, and extended constructed response items. Calculators were allowed on one part, but there were short constructed response sections where it was not allowed. Very similar to what we have been seeing for the last few years. Okay, here's an example of a 4th grade multiple choice item. Key to the 4th grade standards. Fractions. 5th grade, adding fractions. Okay. This would be an extended constructed response, the mathematic equivalent of the essay. You can see there are multiple parts there. Here's another 5th grade sample. Okay. And in middle school, again, key to the Common Core standards, notice that one of the things that is different, the cluster groups listed here are different for our middle school than it was for our elementary school. So that's exactly how the Common Core standards are designed. Same types of responses, and the calculator use is identical to what we see in the elementary school. Okay, here's a 6th grade example. If you've been attending these presentations over the years, you've probably noticed that with the Common Core state standard aligned NJS items, the level of rigor has been increasing. 7th grade item, constructive response. And of course, science. So we said it's the death knell for the New Jersey Ask, but we will continue to administer the 4th and 8th grade science assessments for New Jersey Ask. Just we will, the language arts and mathematics portions will transition over to part. So the breakdown of science is identical to what we've seen in the past. Science is still aligned to the New Jersey core content standards for science. And the science New Jersey Ask is a combination of multiple choice and open-ended items. Okay. Here's a 4th grade sample dealing with the water cycle and the properties of water. 8th grade. Okay, and so on to our data. Okay, so as we go through this, I'll explain the charts here and how they're laid out. So when our scores are reported back, the students are their performance is categorized into 3 possible ranges. We have below 200, the student scores below 200. New Jersey Ask is scored on a range between 100 and 300. So 199 or below would be considered partially proficient. That's the 2 columns all the way on the right. 200 to 249 is considered to meet the standards. That's proficient. And then 250 to 300 is advanced proficient. So when we take a look at our students' performance and our subgroup performance, it's reported by school district, by district factor grouping, which is a socioeconomic grouping based on old census data, which is really sort of a defunct system for comparing schools, but it is our only comparative data that we have at this point in the year. So it's still useful to take a look at our students' performance compared to the district factor group. And then we also get we get scores back, the state as a whole. And usually those aren't very useful numbers for us to compare to, because our children here score much higher than we see statewide. So when you look up here, the way it's organized, we have Bernards Township score on top, followed by district factor group, followed by the state. Now, you see some of these boxes are green. And so green, of course, indicates good information for us, good news for us. And so what that means is that where you see a green number, the Bernards Township, our children, scored above that of their district factor group comparison. If we're looking at the advanced proficient column, if we're looking at the partially proficient column, that means that our partially proficient numbers were lower than that of the district factor group comparison. And so as we go through this, when we have this comparison data, we called it out. We called the good news out in green. So the more green we see, the better it is for us. Okay? So you can see in 3rd grade, in language arts, we have some good news. 4th and 5th grade for both language arts and math. And you can see our partially proficient numbers in 4th and 5th grade are lower than our district factor group counterpart. So lots of good news to see there. Okay. Here's grade 3, broken down by some of our subgroups that I mentioned earlier. So we have our Bernards Township, district factor group, and these sets of charts, we took the state data out because it's just not very useful and sort of crowds us here. And then you can see our subgroups we look at our total students, that's everyone together in the grade level. We have GE as our general education students. SE would be our special education students. And so we have language arts over math. Okay? So again, green means good. This means our percent at or above state standards. This is a combination of our proficient and advanced proficient added together. So one way to think of that is passing. What percentage of students pass? And So you can see for total students, we have very high numbers, which is something to feel good about. And for general ed, we're in the 90s for third grade. So that's great. Mean scale score, that's our average, the average score on language arts and math. And so recall, we want to see numbers above 200, and advanced proficient would be at 250. So you can see total students for mathematics is over advanced proficient as our average score. And for our general education students, it's well above. It's not uncommon, we're going to see over and over again, that the scale scores for mathematics within Burns Township, as well as within the state and within our district factor grouping, tend to be much higher than that of language arts. Okay, so it's not really useful to, what that doesn't mean is that math is much stronger than language arts. It means that the scales are very different. Okay, so here's a breakdown of third grade by school. And so, without looking at green numbers here, because it's all pretty good news, what we notice when we look at third grade or fourth grade or fifth grade for that matter, language arts or math, is that 3 of our schools perform statistically very, very similarly. And one of our schools tends to outperform the other 3. And of course, that Mount Prospect school tends to have the higher test scores, but all of the test scores are pretty positive. One thing for us to think about, and there aren't a lot of lessons to be learned here, right? Because this test is going away and it's going to be gone. But one of the things that we would pay close attention to would be, for example, our special ed population here below 200. So that would be something to look at, and that's something to think about as testing transitions. When we look at these scores, all very, very strong. Okay. Here's a 5-year look back. So you can see this is a graphic representation of what we were talking about before. Keep in mind that the scale here is ranging from 210 to 50. It's not a full range from 100 to 300. So we're only looking at one slice of the band here. But you can see that the blue here is our district factor group. These 3 schools statistically are pretty close. When we try to look at significance, there's not really much of a statistical significance of the difference between these 3. What we do see is that there is a significant difference between Mount Prospect's third grade performance and the other 3 schools. Okay, so this is language arts. Here's mathematics. Okay, we mentioned that the scale, that the mean scale scores tend to be much higher. And that advanced proficient band is right here, so it's sort of exciting to see all of our schools over top of that lineup. That's great news. Okay, grade 4. Lots of green on grade 4. I'll go a little bit more quickly now since we've all warmed up to the way the data is presented here. But you can see in grade 4, all of our subgroups, math and language arts, are in a good spot relative to the district factor group. So our passing rate, percent at or above state standards, higher in every subgroup in both. Okay, our scale scores also are high. So that's great. Here we have our mean scores by school. Same pattern that we saw before. You'll see some additional information, and we have science in here. Can't forget science. Science is important, right? And you'll see that our science scores also look really good. When I see this makes me smile. This is hanging on my refrigerator at home. Okay, here's our language arts 5-year look back. Now, another thing just to note is it changes each year, and trying to track performance by cohorts and things like that, and what are the curricular ramifications of these things. The test changes every year, okay, and that's important to note. And our barometer of those changes is this blue line here. That's our district factor group mean. So you can see that that bounces around similarly to our scores. But we want to try to, when we work on this data, and when the supervisors have this and the teachers are looking through this, we're looking for patterns. Okay, here's our mathematics. You can see that our green bar is pretty much off the chart there. They're all very, very high. Great news. Okay, here's our science scores. Terrific news. Okay, grade 5, more good news. Okay, here's our comparison. No surprise, same pattern we saw. Cedar Hill, Liberty Corner, Oak Street, strong performance, very similar performance. Mount Prospect, very strong performance, a little bit higher. Okay. Here's our language arts. Mathematics. Okay. And now on to the middle school. Okay, so recall this is the same layout that we saw with the elementary data, where we have our, this time we have 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. We have our advanced proficient column, proficient, partially proficient, William Annan's data above the district factor group, above the student. So you can see our 6th grade language arts and math, very positive. 7th grade language arts, so it's very positive. Math is very close. It's equal in the partially proficient numbers here. 8th grade, we see math looks very positive. Our language arts partially proficient rate, very low. Okay. Okay, grade 6, very strong performance. One thing that's exciting to note, 100% of our general ed students were at or above the state standards. Okay. Here's our 5-year look back. So what we want to see in this instance is we want to see the blue bar higher than the red bar, right? So the red bar would be our district factor group. The blue bar is Bernards Township. And we can see that that is, in fact, the case this year. That has been historically the pattern. Last year we saw a blip where it was below, but this year it's very, looks very good. Here's our mathematics. Okay. Mean scale score above advanced proficient. Okay. 7th grade, very high passing rates. Both language arts and mathematics. Here's our comparison. Again, good news here. 7th grade, or 7th grade math, slightly below, but very close. This is our advanced proficient line here, very close. Okay, 8th grade, so culminating grade of middle school. Lots of good news. Very high passing rates. Okay. So you can see very high scale scores. Okay. Language arts. Mathematics. Okay. On to the HESPA. All right, so the HESPA, the High School Proficiency Assessment. This is our assessment for high school students, which is first semester to 11th grade students. Okay? Broken down by reading, writing, and mathematics. Okay? We have expository, speculative, and persuasive writing prompts. Okay. Math, again, aligned to the Common Core state standards. A combination of multiple choice and open-ended. Okay. Here's an example of open-ended math problem. You can quickly do this at your seat. Okay. Maybe not. Okay. So, to the data. All right, so this is a test that's important because this is a graduation requirement. So the NGS is important, but not a graduation requirement. This is one of those tests that, you know, we paid very, well, we paid very close attention to all of our assessments, but this is the high stakes. When we talk about high stakes tests, this is our most high stakes test. So some exciting things to note. A lot of green in here, so that's always, you know, happy news with comparison to our district factor group counterparts. But if you look at our passing rates, especially language arts, very, very high. Our passing rate for special ed, 93.4%. This is first time 11th grader data. So this isn't the, I had another shot and took it later. This is our first time 11th grader data. Very exciting. Very high, you'll notice, very high passing rates in mathematics as well. Okay, same scale scores. Our Burns Township mean scale scores, language arts, for total students in Gen Ed in the advanced proficient range. Very exciting. Okay. Again, we want that blue bar higher than the red bar, and we want it as high as possible, right? So here we go, and we're above that advanced proficient line. So great language arts news. The math news, also very, very good. A little bit below the district factor group, but right at that line. You'll notice that at the high school level is where we see the threat in language arts and math scores. Two different tests. Okay. All right, and the biology competency test. This is our high school science test. It's administered to any student who is completing a first-year biology course. Here in Burns Township at Ridge High School, this means our 9th graders for the most part. This is not a test that's administered to our AP biology students. So these are almost exclusively 9th graders. Okay. So a lot of numbers to look at here. The ones that we want to focus on. Here's our comparison number for passing. That's advanced proficient or proficient. Here is our total student number. Here's our general ed passing rate, special ed passing rate, and then we have it broken down by some of our other subgroups as well. Okay. Here's a comparison. Note that our blue bar is not as high as our red bar. So that's something that I know the biology teachers are looking at. One thing to note, which I should have mentioned a moment ago, this is a test that's required for us to administer. It's not a test that's required for graduation. Okay. This is a test that will also continue with PARC. So the PARC will continue to administer the New Jersey biology competency test. Okay. I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Heinemann to talk about some of our analysis, procedures, and conclusions we have.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. So in some ways, I think it's a little boring to be the test coordinator for Burns Township because our students tend to do so well. We saw a lot of green squares. We talked a little bit about, even in the worst case, what we typically look at is that we are at the mean for our district factor group. So in New Jersey, that means you're at the mean for the highest scoring district factor group in one of the highest scoring states. So it's pretty rarefied company we're competing against. So even being at the mean in a bad case is still a pretty good result. So normally, I'm talking now about NJS. We'll be looking for changes for next year. We'll look at the data and what that told us in regards to changing to improve our test results. But of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is terminal data. So making improvements to our curriculum to improve our NJS results would not make a lot of sense. So, that being said, what would we be doing instead? Well, as you know, what we're instead doing is getting ready for PARC. Okay, PARC testing will be here shortly. It'll be upon us in a few months. And most of what we've done is preparing for that. And we've had Mr. Hall, I know, doing much in the way of technology work, preparing the teachers with keyboarding skills because this is a computer-based test, talking about the Chromebook rollout. We've had Ms. Wolf was with us tonight, looking at new ways to assess students in the classroom with PARC-type questions on math assessments. Mr. Hunter with us tonight. I watched him training all our teachers on the new PARC rubric. Now we're using that internally in the district to score our own district writing samples, preparing students and teachers for this new administration that's upon us. So I will not talk more about that, because we'll talk more about PARC in November, and give everyone a refresher update. Because as I mentioned at the beginning, the state has been very good about screaming new information on us, seemingly willy-nilly, as they desire, with Tuesday releases to the public. And as we try to keep up with them and make changes, we'll fill everyone back in on the board and the public come November on these updates. So what is the future of testing to wrap everything up? Well, we talked about PARC. What do we have coming up this spring? We have the PBA in March. It's basically a window to the entire month of March. And we have the end-of-year assessment from late April into May. Okay? On October 17th, each building principal will be releasing their specific school schedule to the public for the exact testing dates. As PARC basically says, here's a 4-week window. By the end of that 4-week window, you must test all of your students. They don't care if it's all in week 1 or spread amongst 4 weeks. That's really up to each individual school district. Original details on PARC, if you want more information, were presented last year. And as I mentioned, more information will come in November. And that is the fall testing report. Mr. Mark. Should we pass this to the second?
Okay, I'll start with my high-level question, because I was telling Mr. Hall I've probably sat through this presentation as a board member 7 or 8 times already. And every year we have the bars, year over year over year. As we transition to PARC next year, are we going to have any kind of metric in place to compare how we did versus the state and district factor J group and NJS, and to see if we're performing comparably with the PARC? Exactly.
That's a great question. Okay. And so the idea would be, next year when we're doing this presentation, would there be another set of bars on that graph? And so the answer as of today is we think no. We think that we will be starting from scratch saying this is year 1 data. That being said, I would not be completely shocked and surprised if the state of New Jersey came out and said, well, there's some correlation they're going to draw between NJS and PARC. That would not be a complete shock to me. But the information we have now is that no, there will be no comparative data over the years. This will be a fresh start. That's kind of the reasoning behind not having a count, really, for graduation, because we don't have that data. So my guess is going to be, once again, it will be fairly boring next year, which will be year 1 data, what conclusions you draw from it. It's tough to see without that longitudinal data. So you're going to have a single graph. It'll be very easy to look at on the screen. It'll be a single graph of 1 set of bars. Yeah, that's point. Yeah, a single point. Exactly.
Yeah, but the single point will compare to the state and the DM.
The same, will not compare to DFG. DFG is gone. It'll be comparing to our new peer group.
Well, the new peer group.
Right, exactly. And that will be, and we'll always do that with the state report card. So we'll compare to that, and the state, which they always do.
Okay. Second question, and it's a little bit more specific with how we use the data, and I'm just going to use as an example. It looked like our 3rd grade math NJS scores this year weren't as strong as some of our other areas. Now I know we're still way above average and all that, but how do we take that data curricularly to get that particular cohort group performing more strongly in future years?
Right, and that's a tough question for 2 reasons, right? It's a different group of students, and they took a different test than last year's 3rd graders. So different kids took a different test. You know, that's like saying, you know, the football players lost, what's it going to talk about the baseball team playing tomorrow? It doesn't really help you very much. That being said, if you see consistent 3rd grade performance low, then you can start looking at maybe something's occurring, or if you see them not catching up. There was one other data point here, and it's skipping my mind at the moment, but it was a little low one year. I think it was 6th grade going to 7th grade. Last year's 6th graders had a little bit of a blip, but then now they're outperforming district factor group peers. That's the same kids taking a different test who didn't perform as well as their peers in 2003, and now in 7th grade they outperformed their peers on the math test in 2004. So, why does that happen? That's very difficult to assess, and that's something we always struggle with looking at data. Is it inconsistency in curriculum? Is it the group of students? Is there something that we can track over time? But generally, we find those things tend to kind of wash away when we look at that longitudinal data.
To add to that, one of the things we can do is we look at the cluster of performance relative to those peer groups. So not just holistically the scale score, but you go in and you look at what particular component and look for patterns there over time. So if it's below, are we seeing that there's one cluster that tends to be relatively low compared to the district factor group or other comparison numbers? And then that would suggest that there's a curricular issue. When we go through, I can speak about the science scores. When I go through and I look at that, it's noise. There is no consistent pattern in which ones are relatively low or high, which, in that case, it's not all that useful. But we do go in there and can take a look at those things.
And I know that when we did the pilot testing for the park, we didn't get anything back. We just took the pilot test. So I don't know, maybe you guys do know. Do we know yet what the reports are going to look like after the kids pay for the park? I don't think we did. We don't. So in other words, Matt's talking about cluster scores, right? So theoretically, cluster score ties to some content areas, ties to some standards that you're trying to measure. Hopefully, the park will get reported in a way where we can see the same kinds of things. So while the scales may be different, maybe there will be a pattern between the tests in content areas or clusters, so that we might be able to make some connections that way. I think it's going to have a lot to do with how park reports on how students, how well they did or didn't do on various content stands.
Right. As an example, matching that, in the full testing report, in the biology competency test, there was a statistically significant difference in, I think, the cluster of reproduction and heredity. So there was something where we had a little blip on the radar that our performance in that was not consistent with the rest of our performance. So that'd be a case where you say, well, how long are we teaching that unit? Are we teaching it much longer than schools normally teach that unit? Is that causing some other cluster to be lower maybe because we're teaching less of it? So that's kind of becomes the balancing act, and a lot of that is determined by the fact of what report we end up getting back from work and how early we get it back as well. Because obviously we do curriculum writing in summer, right? So if we get the report back like we do with this data literally came to us 2 weeks ago that you're seeing a report on. So if we get it back now, this summer's gone, right? So our curriculum response to it is more of an instructional and training response until the following year. So there's this tremendous lag time that's created, which is one of the reasons I mentioned the promise of Park was to get rid of some of that lag time. If you're getting data mid-July even, and you schedule curriculum learning for August, you can make quicker changes in response to it. But if we're stuck again with mid-September data, with our cycle in this district, it makes it very difficult.
And one of the other promises of Park, we are comparing to the district factor group data, which admittedly is not a great measure anymore. It's based on old census data. So we have our peer group schools, but we won't see that data until the performance reports come out, and then we have to go in and then mine it out, okay, to compare. And so for the October assessment report, we don't have that data yet. So one of the promises of Park is not that we're going to be being able to compare ourselves against other communities like ours within the state, but nationally. So it's going to open up the number of districts that we can hopefully be comparing to and being able to drill down and get some real, learn some very good lessons about our programs.
I know when we first started talking about Park, they had talked about a beginning of the year assessment that was not going to happen right away, but maybe later, that would make it more like a map test that we have where we have to measure growth during the year. Have you heard anything about that recently?
That's their beginning of the year diagnostic test. What we have heard so far is that they plan to pilot it small scale this year. It's not available this year. And at the end of last school year, in I believe it was early June, I went to a presentation from the state testing coordinator. And he mentioned that that would actually be a test that the company would charge for. So
like if you wanted to get rid of map testing, use that instead or something would be an option.
Perhaps down the road.
And a lot of that depends on really, if you're talking about how quickly you get the data back from it.
Yeah, if you don't get it back, then you might as well stick with map
Exactly.
testing.
We get map
since you
testing
get it
data
back.
back very
Yeah.
quickly once we close that testing.
Right.
And one of the things at this point, the state hasn't even set the passing scores for park. So we don't know what those passing scores are yet. So any sort of, any of this comparison data, they're not sure what we're going to see.
And not to mention, the other piece we haven't really talked about is what we're looking at is achievement data, right, for NJS and HSPA. And part of what we're going to see in PARC is that growth piece, which you're somewhat familiar with MAP, right, student growth. So talking about looking at our school report card, one of the concerns is not, we know our kids achieve well. That's really not even a question, right? Our kids achieve well here. The question is, are they growing at the rate that we're happy with, right? Or a rate that's comparative to similar peers across the country or across other districts in New Jersey. So once you get that data, that's really a whole other piece to look at, So we're all very much in the same boat, wondering, we don't have pilot data. We're going to all wait to see when those tests, anxiously awaiting, next, hopefully before August, but at least in August, wondering what that's going to look like down the road.
We weren't allowed to even informally collect performance data on students. We knew they weren't going to go back, and we were forbidden to stand behind kids and score with us if they didn't go back. So we had no idea.
We still don't get the growth data until January, February.
For the next year.
Yeah, well, I mean, from this last testing cycle.
Yeah.
Of this coming winter, we should see the growth information from the spring administration and this one test. Then we have to revisit teacher evaluation.
And that growth, of course, won't be compared to the growth we'll see in the future on PARC, because we'll see it.
And they've acknowledged that for a community like ours with very high-performing students, the tools, the New Jersey Ask and the HSPA, do not do a great job of measuring the full extent of what those students know, because that's the only way to learn. So the PARC is designed to measure the full range. So our growth information we get back promises to be much more informative than what we're seeing.
I know we're moving on to PARC, but is there anything you've learned from this data that you want to make changes for this school year or even next school year? You said the all the good people are working on it, but are you going to do anything, make any changes?
Well, speaking for myself,
I didn't see it in here.
speaking for myself, we are looking closely at the science data. The science is sort of overshadowed by the math and language arts, but we're looking at the cluster data and looking for patterns. The New Jersey Ask data that I have, there are no discernible patterns at this point, but we have seen some, as Dr. Heinemann mentioned, in the biology competency test. The biology teachers have that data, to link in some of the other things that we've been talking about. PLC meetings, that's one of the focuses of their PLC meeting, is here's our data, here's the data from last year's students. What lessons can we learn from that? Curricularly or instructionally. So one of the things that we've been discussing is, as a complication, that test is in a graduation requirement. And over the last few years at Bridge, that message has gotten out to kids. So are they taking it as seriously as they perhaps should be in a way that we can, have good data? So we're talking about the messages that we send as instructors about the importance of the test. So that would be one example. Dr. Heinemann mentioned some of the cluster data as well. Are we over-teaching some things, under-teaching? So we are using that data.
So the cluster, as Matt talked about, the cluster group data, I think is the big thing. It's really
ground truthing, right? It is what we see happening, does that make sense? We can match up with what's happening in the classroom. And I think the reality is, although you want to look at this data and say, how can this help, move us forward into a brand new test with different types of questions and completely different rules. So to make changes, the impact on them would be completely random. I mean, we'd be like going through a scientific experiment and changing 5 variables and then running an experiment again. It really would have completely no use. You wouldn't have any idea of what really had an effect on the next test. And so, unfortunately, this is kind of a curious year. Now we have terminal data. We're going to have a year next year where once again we're going to be coming with a single point in time, right? And there's one test for one student taking this test. Here's what that student did. Not saying, well, over the course of 3 years, we see students progressing in a certain way. So it's going to be very difficult for many schools to make a lot of wholesale changes. So the changes we've made, and that's why I put that slide up there, is really preparing for PARC, making sure the Common Core, right? So we have the Common Core standards, our curriculum, and then our instruction. And then the measuring stick of that is going to be this PARC assessment. So what we're trying to do is make sure we have our ducks in a row for this piece of it, so that when PARC comes, our kids are going to have a good initial measure of their success based upon our curriculum and instruction. And then from there, we can really talk about making some changes.
So you spoke about science. I know the other groups are here. Just generalize, can you tell me, are you making any changes in the other ones other than biology? English, math?
Specifically, no. Like I said, no. Because for instance, Mr. Hunter was training them on the new rubric for PARC. And so the rubric that Matt Paul showed you is not even in use anymore because it's for the old test. It was a brand new rubric.
I think maybe you're confusing like what they're doing curriculum changes to their actual curriculum versus how teachers are using the results to address students in classrooms. I think with the math testing, they get a breakout of all the different strengths of students
All the
that they
specific
teach,
skills.
and then they can work on the skills. So I think there's like 2 separate questions. I just want to know that we're getting this report, we've made all these presentations. It's essentially going in the trash because you're not really doing that much with it. Because you really can't, because you're having a whole separate curriculum. So that's why I asked the question.
Well, now I want to make Matt feel like he did all that work.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to get at. What are you going to do about it? And it seems like not much. And I didn't think you were. I didn't expect you to. I was wondering.
But what we do get is a lot of questions. We're able to ask better questions about what's going on.
Don't forget too, when we get this data, the one thing that we're waiting on, and I mentioned this, sorry, old habits die hard, I can't help it. Is we use the data to look and make instructional support placements. So I know that Ms. Holt and Mr. Huncher, along with the principals, will look and make those placements in instructional support using the data. Because remember, what we talked about year after year is the first place that I used to go to, and I know that these gentlemen and Ms. Wolf go to, is they go right to look at the partially proficient, because that's our weakness. We want to address that immediately. That's what we're looking at. We look at the partially proficient and then the instruction.
Right, so on an individual student basis, no, thank you. And for an individual student basis, it does have a use in the fact that if we need a data point for this year for a particular student and their potential for being successful in language arts and mathematics, we do have the ability to go back and use this test.
I don't want to leave my back, so I want to stand up. In case there's anybody in the audience, I don't want to leave my back. You did a great job in giving this to us in advance. It's the first time I can remember that we had something to look at. So I spent some time with it. So I'm going to say some plus things and some minus things. Plus things first, thank you for giving this to me. And then you changed the slides a little bit. In the beginning, I didn't have that, so. But thank you for the slides. J-factor is not a very good comparison for us. I don't think it should be used. I'm sure you get a summary by J-factor, but it's not a good cross-section in my humble opinion. Doesn't, I don't know who it has, but I could have got that this afternoon by deciding not to. But Milburn, Princeton, the Windsors, North and South, Tenafly, Montgomery, Homedale, Ridgewood, Chatham, New Providence, those are the great districts in the state. And the J-factor don't include all those. So you would acknowledge that? I don't think it's a good measure. apologize, is an awful lot like Obamacare. We don't know what the heck it is. It may work, it may not work. It's a major, major problem. State averages, New Jersey ranks relatively high in the 50 states in the Union. And when we start talking about national comparisons, I think New Jersey's going to go way down. Because then we compared with marginal states, I think we're in the top 10 right now. And I think when you take the average test scores and start comparing them nationally, you're going to see decay because you're going to see decay comparing themselves with lesser states. I'm troubled by Mount Prospect being so far ahead and the other 3 elementary schools being lower. What's interesting, the other elementary schools seem to change position. And 3rd grade might be one level, and then 4th grade shifts a little bit, and 5th grade shifts a little bit. I wonder how much analysis we're doing for curriculum comparisons.
Comment real quick on that? Although they look like they're moving around, we did the analysis on that. They know this statistically are identical as far as being statistically significant.
Yeah, sure. But 1 year Liberty Corner is up, and the next year Cedar Hill is up, and the next year Oak Street is up. It jumps around, and that would be consistent with what you're saying. But it also jumps around, and special ed changes a little bit, and I think 3rd grade and 4th grade seem to be different school by school. Maybe I'm wrong. But that comparison, I don't think you can do with just J-factor. I think you have to do more analysis. But I'm troubled by the unequal performance. And maybe, some schools or the kids in the schools are more interested in sports and more involved with this and less studying. I understand there's a whole lot of different issues, but I'd like to see a little bit closer comparison if we can get that. And in high school, I don't think the J-factor is comparable at all. So I think we need a new measure, and even if you do it manually, if the districts will share the data, I think that's important. AP courses were in the pass out. You didn't talk about the AP courses. It looks like
That's next month's
okay.
presentation. Yeah,
It
the
looks
shades
like
will be here.
there's fewer people taking the tests, so the scores are up, but there's fewer people taking the tests. Ours is a very good district, and we would expect good scores. I want to know, are we getting better? Are we getting better relative to the better schools, or the best schools in the state? And I don't think this type of analysis gets us even close to that. I think you have to do, the Princetons and the Milburns and start comparing, their test scores. And I'm afraid Park is going to just delay us. You guys have to find a way to run the district, even though you get poor results from Park. You have to find a way to make sure that we're closing the gap with the best districts. And I think the only way you're going to do that is more visits, more comparisons, school by school, Milburn and Princeton. I don't think you're going to do it with these testings. I don't see much change year to year. I see that plateauing that we're seeing in the SAT scores. I see it here. And I'm bothered that the district, I don't think is advancing. I think we're fine. It's still a great district. But I'd like to see us get better. So that's, I think, my view. Thank you.
I just had a couple. First of all, one issue that I did notice that looked like it was significant was in the biology test. The percentage of special ed students passing was much lower than the percentage of special ed students passing the math or the English data on the HESPA. So that looked like one thing that just sort of struck. I think it's 47% pass. Now, I don't know what the number was for, you didn't break it out for DFG schools, so I don't know whether that's the typical amount of special ed students passing that test, but obviously we've done so well in the other two areas that that looks like something that, needs to be focused on. But one thing, whenever I get this sent home and we look at it, you always start noticing who's on top and who's not, and where we're winning kind of or not. And I noticed that, third and fourth grade things tend to move around a little bit, but the thing that I really like to see was that in fifth grade, we're on top in everything, and in eighth grade, we're on top in everything. So it may be the way we structure our curriculum, or something else that's making, one school do better at one time, or our third grade language be lower than the other districts. But with respect to what Mike said, it's my understanding that we will have a new group to compare ourselves to next year, which probably will be better than the one we have now. And also, we're going to have the opportunity to have tests where, the value of this Mount Prospect score that's at 300, doesn't really tell us anything, because if they were 300 last year and they're 300 this year. So hopefully, my understanding of how the park's supposed to work is that it's going to be more rigorous, and so we're going to see, is it 350, is it 301, and have they moved from the year to year? So that's something I'm looking forward to with the park. I know there's many negatives, but there are some positives that we're going to have more real data about, in all of our cases, where we have all these people highly proficient. How highly proficient are they? And hopefully, I think that's something we're all hoping to get from this data.
I just had one comment, and in the packet that we got on Friday, there was some introductory material, and it said that this is the first year that the NJS is actually aligned with the Common Core, and that the first year that the Common Core questions actually count, and the fact that our scores were still high and about the same kind of patterns we had seen in the past, it sounds like good news to me, that we're doing a good job.
We agree. Be hopeful anyway.
With teaching the Common Core to the kids and their mastering the material. So I know we do have to see what happens with Park, but that seems like some good news.
Absolutely. And of course, the thing that is not the same is going to be the rigor of the questions. The question types are different. So them matching the standard, they did a good job at that. But that's really the only thing we still have out there is that next challenge is how do those students respond to those more rigorous questions? Because that speaks to what you said about getting rid of that ceiling at 300 and extending it to see, well, if we have 10 kids at 300, is it that they're all around 300, or is one kid at 380, and then one kid's at 310, and one kid's at 340? What does that expand to? So that's really still that great unknown, because we have zero data. You have kids you might suspect, you might have a kid who scores 300, and you would say, they're capable of a lot more than this test was able to ask from them. And so it should be interesting, but it is certainly a little scary that we have this kind of unknown out there waiting for us.
Algebra, I didn't see algebra in the breakdown in the school. Common Core, I understand, pushes algebra back.
Well, we'll be testing on algebra in the upcoming test this year.
In the middle school.
Any student taking algebra, so wherever they take the course. So what's going to happen is basically test then become key to a course. So you take the algebra test whenever you take the algebra course, regardless of taking 7th grade or 9th grade. It's just it's an end of course test. No, you're talking about the standards. So algebra and the standards, right, that shifted in the Common Core. As far as the testing goes, you take the algebra test when you take the algebra course, regardless of when you take it. Just actually like biology. So when you look at the biology data, we have our 9th graders. If another school gives it an 11th graders course, our 9th graders compared to their 11th graders, that's when you take biology. And so, once again, what does that look like when we come back from Park? Are they going to tell us, here is your 7th grade algebra students in comparison to other peer groups, 7th grade algebra students? We would hope so, because that data would be useful. If they tell you, here is your algebra students compared to, every algebra student that is out there, well, that's a little less useful.
But doesn't Common Core deal with math, and isn't the Park test going to do math in 8th grade?
It will. However, the guidance we've been given is if we're teaching algebra to students in middle school, they would take the algebra test in lieu of the 8th grade.
It'll be a different test. That makes it even more confusing.
No, it'll be the algebra test. But they might have 7th grade peers sitting for the 7th grade Park test, so it's 7th grade math. And in another class, you would have 7th grade algebra students taking the 7th grade Park algebra test.
So one thing I wanted to reiterate, because I think I might have not made this clear earlier. You mentioned the schools we should be comparing ourselves to. And the reason that's not included in this report is that data is not available yet. Okay.
I wanted to.
Thank you.
Okay, we are up to public forum on agenda items. If anyone has any comments or questions on anything on the agenda, please come up and write your name and address on the clipboard.
Michelle, we can't hear you.
What difference we see between the honor students taking the college prep students, and then I know that there's kids that are special ed in college prep classes. I'm wondering if there's a difference between the success of those kids versus the kids who, and I don't even know where the other ones may go, but the really special ones, they get like some kind of pull-out science, and if there's any difference that you saw there. So I was wondering about that. And I think I might have missed when you talked about the peer group, so I'm wondering if you would mind explaining it again. Who they are, and but I think maybe it was something that I talked about last year. Is that who we're still sticking with? Oh, really? Okay, so that means we totally abandoned the accent. No? Oh, okay, all right, so maybe you could tell me that. And then, I don't know if this is the right time for this, but it kind of goes along with like the end of the year part and all that kind of stuff. We just got the notice from Mr. Howard about the final exam or the final assessment things. And I was wondering, I think it's a great idea and whatever we're going to do. But what I was wondering is there any chance that we would consider, if we really are doing this with the idea of getting kids ready to take in college, are we going to teach them how to do it? And what I mean by that is, you could go along with the curriculum, like the regular thing that we always do, and then June give them the paper. And so they should, go ahead, study out, whatever. Or we could say, the beginning of the second semester, we could say, I don't know if this is possible, but if we could say to the kids, we just did World War I. If I were, to try and help you prepare for the final assessment, I'm going to tell you, focus on the three things that led up, the most important three things that led up, and then we learn as a final result. And then when you get to World War II, you can point out the next things that you think are important. If you don't show them how to study for a final, just giving it to them, I don't know if I see any of that. So I was wondering if you could maybe consider like all that test taking skills we were talking about, like along maybe we could finally do it in high school. Thank you.
Is there anyone else for public comment? On agenda items? Well, I think, yeah, we can respond. Yeah.
Just to speak to that question, Michelle, we do still use the MAG 7, but the MAG 7, much of those school districts are part of the peer group. So actually, when Jill Shays does her presentation next month, you're going to see she identifies all the peer groups because we pull the AP testing data and the SAT data from the school report cards from the prior year, but we use the peer groups because the peer group is not what the state's using. But you'll see most of the districts, for instance, that Mike referenced are in the peer group, but there are some odd ones that we wouldn't have expected necessarily. It's still based on demographic data, it's still based on the education in the community, it's still based on the state assessment scores, and this college readiness number that Joe's going to talk about when she gives the presentation. So there's a lot of overlap, but last year, that's probably what you remember. Jill did speak a little bit about the peer group being different, but she included some of the oldies but goodies as well. So for instance, Milburn is no longer in our peer group according to the state, but we included them when we looked at the SATs and the APs, which you'll see next month.
Thank you, Sean. Mike?
I just want to make one comment about college preparation. I believe it's hard work and time on task. And if you teach the kids how to put the extra time in and the extra effort, they're going to do fine. And if we don't teach them that, they're not going to be as successful as they look like. So that's my opinion.
Okay, we're up to committee reports. We have finance. There are 4 items. Would someone like to make a motion for items 1 through 4 under finance? Elaine? Someone second. Linda? Thank you. Elaine, do you want to make that?
These are, number 1 is the usual list of disbursements. Number 2 is professional development expenses, which is also a recurring item. Number 3 and 4 are happy ones, which is we're accepting donations from the PTO in the amount of $6,250 for the purchase of auditorium curtains, a document camera, and CD player. And I was just, as I was sitting here, I was looking for thinking, but you can see why they probably want to replace them. And then number 4 is the accepting a donation from the Oak Street PTO in the amount of $4,500 for the purchase of 30 Chromebooks. And that's it.
Anyone have any questions? Roll call, please.
Mr. Byrne? Mrs. Werner?
Yes.
Mrs. Gray?
Yes.
Mrs. Cassell?
Yes.
Mrs. McGowan?
Yes.
Mrs. Shaw?
Yes.
Mrs. Richmond?
Yes.
Mrs. Woolridge?
Yes.
Mrs. McEwen?
Yes. We're up to personnel. There's just 1 item under personnel. Would someone like to make a motion for item 1? Oh, okay, yeah. Okay. Somebody want to make a motion? Susan, thank you. Preeti, second, thank you. Any questions?
November 20th, 2013.
Correct. 2014, not 2015. Yep.
2014. The year was wrong. 2014.
Could we have a roll call, please?
Mr. Byrne? Mrs. Werner?
Yes.
Mrs. Gray?
Yes.
Mrs. Cassell?
Yes.
Mrs. McGowan?
Yes.
Mrs. Shaw?
Yes.
Mrs. Richmond?
Yes.
Mrs. Woolridge?
Yes.
Mrs. McEwen?
Yes. Okay, curriculum hasn't met.
Curriculum is meeting on Friday, the 10th.
And on policy?
Policy met last Monday. Minutes were delivered minutes before this meeting began. I just wanted to run down, we had a lot of policies on our agenda. We didn't get real far, but we expect to make a lot of ground up at our next meeting next Monday. I wanted to go through how to really read the minutes in conjunction with the other attachments. Now, with Strauss Esme giving us the policy updates, they give us monthly these things they call policy alerts. And the one we were reviewing on the first part of our agenda was alert number 2 and 3, which was actually the June alert. This was deferred until September because policy didn't meet over the summer. In your attachments with these minutes, I want you to make sure you note there's something called a policy alert summary. And that's a really handy document, and it comes from Strauss Esme. And it lists the documents or the policies in the alert release. It gives an overview of what state action happened to require these policy revisions, and an estimate of how many policies will be looked at because of it. And then for each policy, it gives a real nice summary of what changed and why. And it's a really good guideline to go to as a companion to reading the policy. It makes it a lot easier to know what you're looking for and the changes. The policies we looked at were 2412, home instruction due to a health condition. 2417, the pupil intervention and referral services. 24881 was the home or out of school instruction for general education pupils. And we got up to number 5200, attendance. Each of these policies, I won't go through the major changes now. We expect that they'll be advanced as well as the others for first reading in our next meeting. We also had open on our agenda the policy that was referred to us for our board goals, which was the, what was that called? The committee policy, 52, I don't know what the number was, the committee policy. 0155. And we also have to look at, if we have time, the next alert, which was the alert number 204, and that has a whole list of policies as well. So if we get through all of those, there'll be quite a lot coming on the next agenda for updates. Thank you, Susan. Does anybody have any questions? Okay. We're up to the advocacy committee. We met this morning, and I actually typed the minutes because I've been procrastinating and getting on my nerves. So I actually went home and did them. So I sent them out. I don't know if anyone had time to look at them yet. But some of what we talked about, Nick has already gone over. We met with the PTO presidents. He gave an update on the park, which we did tonight. We did mention to PTO presidents that to help spread the word that we don't respond to Facebook, that people need to email us or call us or talk to us if they have questions or comments. We've been being tagged on Facebook and people being frustrated that we're not responding, but we don't respond on there about board issues. We had an update on progress on the drug and alcohol issues. We noted that the Safe Homes flyer went out in the District Friday folder. Nick gave the PTO presidents an update on the status of the voluntary random drug testing. He's meeting with the nurses this week to discuss the status of getting the offices certified as testing sites. We discussed the canine suite that was already mentioned tonight with the PTO presidents and told them that we're going to have a public forum this evening. Nick discussed the policy change that classifies e-cigarettes as drug paraphernalia because they can be filled with other substances besides nicotine. If a student is caught with them, then the suspicion-based testing policy kicks in. And he mentioned that Mr. Howell's going to inform people in a parent letter. He's going to discuss that. Linda, you mentioned the municipal alliance meeting later. Okay. We reminded the PTO presidents about the upcoming Board of Education election. We explained about the different length of terms in the election. It's a little bit confusing. And we told them about the candidates forum on October 13th. Let's see, I already talked about the park update. And that's really it. They had a few questions that Nick and Sean said they were going to look into about different issues at the meeting. And I think you wanted to mention something else about the election.
So one of the other things we talked about was our candidates night. You just said that. And the different folks running for office. And I think actually everyone running for the contested seats is here. So I'll share with you that a query came to the board office about the use of flyers or campaign type materials, and was it okay to distribute those materials at different school events. So I took a look at our policy on this, which is policy 9700, that speaks a little bit about candidates running for any office, whether it's something in the township committee or for Board of Ed. And really what it gets at there is the concept of not making our schools places where we're influencing the students with any kind of material of that nature. And we're not disrupting the business that we're trying to conduct here. I think it's really the spirit of what that policy is all about. So with respect to flyers, for example, obviously you wouldn't come into the school during the day and start running around the building handing out flyers because it's a distraction to what we're trying to accomplish in the building. We wouldn't plaster, vote for so-and-so signs on our grounds or hang posters on the building or the walls. That said, we also don't want to infringe upon people's rights to free speech, so it's a little bit of a balancing act. So what I would say, the way that I would interpret that policy is, if somebody had flyer-related materials that they wanted to distribute outside of our buildings, maybe they want to talk to parents on the sidewalk when they're coming to an evening event. I just want people to respect that they shouldn't disrupt whatever event might be occurring at the school, meaning don't come inside in the middle of a board meeting and start handing out materials, or a student concert because there's a lot of parents there and you want to hand out materials. I just don't think that's appropriate, and I think that that's what our policy is trying to get at. So for ground rules on that issue, I would say after school hours, not during the school day, and outside of the school buildings. That way we know that there's not a disruption to a meeting that's happening inside. Now I will throw out one exception to that, and that would be Candidates Night. Since the entire purpose of Candidates Night is to learn about candidates and their platforms, and so you might be talking to people outside or inside in the high school auditorium, and certainly bringing information about yourself as a candidate or Candidates Night would seem wholly appropriate. So that would be the only exception I think would make sense for the distribution of materials inside the school buildings. And I was just trying to framework something that I thought would be reasonable, and I will put this all down on paper since I discussed it with the board attorney today, and issue it to everyone that is running for not only the board election, but also for anyone who might be running for a township committee or something else on the ballot in November, so that they understand that we respectfully ask folks to not disrupt general school operations and not make our grounds look like, some kind of downtown DC political action center. That's kind of the gist of what I think the policy is about, and I think that should hopefully clear it up. The other thing I will share is that someone was asking about signs with respect to the town, and where the town doesn't allow signage for elections and so on. So I did get an email passed on to me from one of the administrative assistants in the business office who helps to organize information like this. And she had gotten a correspondence from Denise Szabo over at the township committee, or over at the township's office. And she commented that there had been people asking, I guess some people might have asked her about sign rules. She indicated that the township doesn't regulate this type of signage due to First Amendment rights. However, in 2006, the township apparently adopted a resolution with voluntary guidelines concerning the placement of these signs. So she actually gave me a copy of that resolution, and so when I send out a few notes about the flyer issue and signage on school property, I will also share a copy of this resolution that Ms. Szabo passed on to me. Of course, anyone who wants. firsthand information can certainly reach out to the township. I don't want to step on their toes about their ordinances or otherwise. They do have a list, she indicated, that was specifically for temporary signage regarding the posting of charitable events, posting for charitable events. And they apparently have a list that is on their website that lists the approved locations for temporary signage where you're posting about a charitable event. That's a list that they do have, but I don't think.
That must have been a list that.
That might have been a list that somebody heard about, and I know that it was brought up.
I did want to just mention that several years ago, there were some areas in town that we were asked to take our signs down. So there are some areas, despite what they're saying, where they really don't want signs up.
Okay, I'm not going to speak for them except for what she gave me. So if anybody has questions, I would encourage you to talk to Denise or someone in the township office. Yeah, I can reiterate that in my notes to say, this is what I've received, but if you want to get it from the horse's mouth, I would encourage you to do so.
There are also laws on how close you can put signs to a actual polling place, number of feet away, I forget, 200 feet from the polling place.
That's statute.
Yeah.
Yes. I just want to clarify something on Nick. I had asked Valerie before, and I did hand out flyers, and she said the guideline she gave me before was not, you can't go inside the school like you said, but you could do it outside. So for example, at drop-off and pickup, you could do it. So I just think we may want to give some clarification.
I would say after the school day, and the reason that I would avoid things like drop-off and pickup is that if I'm concerned that it might disrupt the operation of the school, I would ask people not to do it. If we're trying to move cars through and someone's trying to reach in the windows and pass things out while we're trying to keep a car line moving, I would prefer not to see that happening. So I'll suggest again, outside of the regular school day and outside of the school buildings, if you please.
Karen, just one minor addition. I live in the hills, and you probably know this as well. There are more restrictions in the hills because it's a master association community, so there are also election laws.
Communities where there's rules about where you can put signs too.
But within 2 weeks of and I used to serve on the board there, within 2 weeks of the election, they have to be allowed as long as you're not within 200 feet of the polling place. Just for anyone who's interested or concerned, because it has occurred that
People have been told to take them down.
yes,
In the
and
hills.
in fact, that's not legal within the 2-week period. So you have every right, and then they must be removed within 24 hours of the election.
That actually goes for all signs, and you can be prosecuted, I think, if you leave your signs up. I think it's the state. I think it makes sense because you just have trash everywhere, so.
But I think if it's on private property.
Well, on private property, you don't have to go, but if it's somewhere else.
It's on private property.
Anything else? Okay, we're up to liaison reports.
Okay, yeah, this is really brief. The Municipal Alliance is meeting tomorrow night, and the Somerset County Ed Services Commission is meeting this Thursday, so I don't have any liaison reports. However, I do have some save-the-date information from the Municipal Alliance. So, some of this you've heard before, but I think some of it may be new. So on October 20th, the Municipal Alliance is presenting the American Drug and Alcohol Survey from this year to the Board of Ed. On October 22nd, Dr. Bradley is coming to Ridge to do a seminar on drugs and alcohol. And on November 20th, at the Burns Township Town Hall at 7 p.m., the Municipal Alliance is doing a presentation on e-cigarettes, marijuana, and tobacco. So, and I'll have more at the next meeting based on tomorrow night's.
Okay, we're up to public forum and other than agenda items. If anyone has something that they would like to speak about, please come up and write your name and address on the clipboard.
I'm here to comment about the quality of our minutes. quality of events, I think, are sparse, and they don't contain documentation to that, so that an interested citizen can get the gist of what's happening. Plus, we don't have a record of what's happened. I would suggest, if you want to, and there's no quality standards I recognize from the minutes, because I looked throughout. But if you go on the Bridgewater Board of Education, you look at their minutes, those are minutes that are meaningful. They have all the supporting documents, and a citizen and everybody can make out exactly what happened and what money is being spent, contracts are being made, and really gives you, enlightens you as to what's going on. Plus, it means it's a very good historical record. And I used to know, Somerville used to have really good records, and we're kind of sparse. I mean, we don't even have supporting documents here for disbursements and things like that. When you have contracts that are being let and awarded, they're not there. The township is in there, they put the awards on their minutes. So I think somebody take a good look at the quality of minutes, look at some of the surrounding school boards. I would say that the gold standard, I would say, is Bridgewater, because they have excellent minutes. Anybody can go in there and figure out just what's going on, where the money's going, who's got contracts, things of that nature. And I think it would be wise for the board to take a look at that. Thank you very much.
Michelle Crowford for Bandit Return. I just wanted to share some really positive feedback regarding back to school night. I have a 10th grader and a senior, and can I say a positive, name the teacher if I'm going to say a positive comment or no? Well, anyway, there's a new chemistry teacher in 10th grade who I've actually never met anyone as impressive as this guy. He worked out in the industry, and then he worked in the finance world, and he's got a doctorate, and the kids adore him, and he's so impressive. So I just really want to share that. I also, for my senior, I would share that even though you think they're cooked and done, she's really thrilled with all of her teachers. So, well, the exception one, but she really is. She's really happy. So, and she doesn't mind. Like, she's got a good amount of homework, and she really does like it. So, I wanted to share that. I also wanted to comment about Algebra 2, and I didn't realize that Kristen was going to leave her. I would have said it before, even though it was out of order. I'm concerned, and back to school night is a really good thing because you get to meet the teacher and everything, but the bad part for you guys is that when you come in, everyone's rumbling, and basically in my Algebra 2 class, and I think we have an amazing Algebra 2 teacher, and I'll tell you why I think they're amazing, is everyone's saying, why are the kids reeling? And the teacher pretty much said, just wait, we're going to do a presentation, and in the presentation he basically said, we're no longer reviewing for Algebra 1, we now have, and I forget the number of topics, but I'll just say, we now have 9 topics instead of 7, so the rigor is intense, but what happened was everyone was talking about, well, which tutor do you have? Oh, I can no longer sign up for him, and it was all bridge teachers. And some of them were already booked, so I did speak to Kristen, I shared it with her today. I don't really like that. We're only 3 weeks in. The first test was Friday, and back to school was prior to the first test, and already the kids are, the parents are saying they're reeling, which usually parents never say anything in public. And they did to this particular teacher, I'm sure he would vouch for it. But the one really good thing about the teacher, and I forgot to say this to Kristen Wolf today, but I have mentioned kind of this. 2 weeks before school started, he sent out something that said, here's the packet that you guys recommended, I urge you to do it, here's the answer key, blah, 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 connection, this is what you should get for school, all the details. And then 2 weeks before the first test, he sent home a study guide to the parents, saying, this is the, and my son's in college prep, this is the study guide, this is the answer key, these are the days we're here. And then along with that, he sent additional materials, like if you did the study guide the weekend before, you could still do these extra materials. He also gave back the quizzes prior to the exam, which was, I'm boasting about that because that's not what everybody did. So when you walk around and you see the other football players and the other hockey players, which happens to be my son's friends, people are saying, you guys got your quizzes back? And we did. And so it's really helpful. But I know we can't tell the teachers what to do, but even though I'm very concerned about Algebra 2 still, I think those things make me feel better. Like, at least we're trying, at least we're handing out the study guide early, at least we're pointing out all the things we can do, we're being like proactive, and I feel like that's really helpful. What can we do about Algebra 2? What I said to the school today is, we're reeling and it's 3 weeks in, why don't we look at it and say, the pace is too fast. The pace is too fast for Ridge, who's typically extremely strong. There's no way there's anybody else going as fast as we are or faster. So why don't we slow down? Why don't we give them a chance to feel confident instead of forcing them out to where our the complementary teachers are all tutoring and booked up already? That's not asking Ridge to me. We should, I know that you feel, we should be able to do it inside the school. And I know from all the other, there's some amazing people here, we can, but as long as we keep it within a reasonable amount of material, they're college prep kids, they're not honors and they're not AP. So that's, thank you.
Hi, I'm Lauren Southwood, and Elaine, you had sent me an email saying that you would discuss at the finance meeting what can be done to improve the security at Cedar Hill Elementary School, and that you would report on it at this meeting. And I was just waiting for the report to see what decisions were being made tonight. Not made,
Yeah, I'm sorry, the finance committee didn't meet yet, because we have a weird schedule this month. We have back-to-back board meetings. Usually it's every other. It's because we have a school board conference at the end of the month, so we had to move it. So I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said this. I'm sorry to say for that reason, but we are definitely going to do it at our next meeting. We just haven't had a meeting since the last meeting we had here. So certainly that's not. And we all are concerned about the same issue, and it's certainly something we take very seriously. And we're, Rod, who is the business administrator, is not here tonight, but I know he and I have talked about making sure that's on the agenda.
Okay, thank you.
Is there someone else for public forums or anyone else on? We are now up to board forum. Linda and I just wanted to give a really quick update from the school board's training that we went to. Do you want to start or do you want me to start?
Well, I can just start.
Okay.
Overview. There were basically 3 major topics.
What was the name of the training?
Okay, it was called Advanced Board Leadership. And it was an all-day training in Princeton on September 27th. And there were basically 3 topics that were covered. The first one was parliamentary procedure, which they really got into quite some details about different types of motions and stuff like that. And it seemed like it was more involved than we typically.
Yeah, we usually don't have problems.
It was not only more involved than what we do here, but it was more involved than what we do at the Somerset County Ed Services Board meetings as well. So, and then the second topic was, which we actually spent more time on, was board committee operations and effectiveness. And we broke out into small groups also to talk about that. And it was interesting to see that different boards do their committees different ways. So there was a couple of suggestions that came out of it, which we may want to talk about, that sounded interesting. One is that was to, instead of just sending the committee agendas to the committee members, there was a suggestion that it should go out to all the board members so that if they had questions before the meeting, they had a chance to query.
Yeah.
So I thought that was actually a good suggestion.
Yeah, that's very good.
And then the second sort of intriguing idea, and I'm not at all sure we want to implement it, but some boards have 3 permanent members on a committee and then 1 rotating member, so that different people get to sit in on committee meetings. It was just a different way of doing it. There was one in my small group there was one school board where they actually, what was he telling me? They had 8 committees. And so every board member was chair of a committee, and they, all their meetings were public. So that was very different. And it worked for them, but it was just, as I said, it just kind of showed that there's different ways of doing committees. And then the third topic was communication, board communication. And the kind of overall message was that the board and the school district need to be proactive about communication rather than reactive, because if you're not telling your story, someone else will do it, and maybe not the story that you want to be out there. So that was kind of the overall message. And then there was quite a bit of discussion about social media and using Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and other social media. But then there was kind of a caveat. We had an attorney get up and do kind of the caveat about concerns being student privacy, equal access, and security. And that you obviously would have to have up-to-date school policies to address all these. So that was kind of just an overview of the day.
Yeah, I mean, I found the breakout sessions to be really useful. The presentations were okay,
Yeah.
but the group that I was in was really interesting because there was a superintendent there, and there were a couple of small school boards that had operated as a committee of the whole, so they didn't have committees. And so there was actually a board president who had been on her board for like 20 years who they had had committees and people were complaining, well, we don't know what goes on the committees. I want to be on this committee. I want to know what's going on in there. And there's so much complaining at 2 different points during the last 20 years that they tried committee as a whole in response to the board members, and it was exhausted both times. Within a couple of months, they went back to having committees because it was just too time consuming and they couldn't cover everything. But they tried it, you know. So it was interesting to hear that. And then the superintendent who was there had also been on a couple of boards that did that also, and he said he didn't like it, and he explained why, which is interesting. He had a lot of the same reasons that she had already explained, but also just the idea that it's hard to bounce any ideas around, you know, when you have more of a set agenda when it's committee of the whole, and you have to get through it. And so he found that when he was working with districts, you know, the board actually wasn't, I think the board would be more involved with the whole boards there all the time, but they were actually less involved in the decision making because you couldn't talk with them as much during the preliminary, you know, idea, like bouncing around stage. So it was interesting to hear from the other districts since we've been having so much discussion on our board about committees lately. But anyway, that was about it. Preeti?
I actually really like that idea of the chair sending or whoever sends out
Yeah, we discussed that already. And it's a good idea because that way if the board member has a question, they can tell it to the committee chair ahead of time so they can ask it.
I like that idea. I thought that was a good suggestion.
Yeah.
What do we need to do? Can we just agree right now that that's how we're going to do it going forward, or do we need to discuss it? Can we discuss it?
Well, I think when we're going to type up that document and send it to policy for the procedure, so we'll put it in that, and then when it goes to policy, they're looking at the policy about committees, and then they'll look at the procedure. We can formalize stuff in that.
You want to do it
I think we should do it formally, right? Put in the procedure. Okay. Susan?
We used to do that 6 years ago or so. When the agenda went out for the committee, it went out to the full board. The backup material went out to the committee, but the agenda went to the full board. And then, people could send questions that they might have on it. But it just went away. I don't know why. We did it a couple of years.
Could I ask you why the backup material would not be sent along with the agenda?
I don't think about it.
So what do you all really think about
A lot of times it needs an explanation with it, so we'll go in then and see the explanation maybe.
Well,
I don't know.
really, except the policy, I don't think a lot of backup information goes with the agenda. When we get the policy, so we can read them.
Curriculum,
Well, that
stuff
comes
comes
with the
after.
It
Yeah.
comes with the minutes. So
It
you
should,
have
yeah, it's finance that does it. Well, we get the finance reports, but you guys don't get them too.
Yeah, we often get those, right,
Everybody gets those ones.
yeah, we get all that. But sometimes, I mean, I think one thing that, I think it's a great idea that we all get the agendas, but sometimes things aren't ready. I mean, that's the only,
Some of it will make sense.
Yeah, and so you might not find out about it, but it's not because someone didn't, they're waiting for something to happen to get it, they're waiting for a contract or something, and so that would be the only caveat I have. But I think it's a great idea, just, because then you kind of know what's going on before you know.
And
also have to understand a lot of times agendas change between when they're first drafted. I don't think we've had a single personnel meeting where stuff wasn't stuck on by the time we met.
But at least
You know,
people
but-
still have a general idea
Yeah.
of some of the stuff.
Yeah.
Does anyone have anything else for board forum? We're up to adjournment.